Hello, everyone, and welcome to our weekly LGBT chat hosted by GCN. And I'm delighted to be here in conversation this week with historian Dr. Patrick McDonagh, who the title of the talk, as you can see, Homosexuals are Revolting, a History of Gay and Lesbian Activism in the Republic of Ireland, 1973 to 1993. So we're going back a little bit in history. And Patrick received his PhD from the European University Institute, and his dissertation was as the same title as the talk. And he's published loads of articles, which I've been reading avidly over the last few days, on the history of lesbian and gay activism in Ireland, in the Journal of the History of Sexuality, Irish Economic and Social History, Journal Studia Irlandesi, Journal of Irish Studies, GCM, and RTE Brainstorm. So you're very welcome to join me this evening, Patrick, and I'm delighted to have you on. And I think we have absolutely loads to talk about. But I was reading your articles over the last day or two to see where we would start. And as I said to you, I had wanted to maybe look at this as beyond the normative narrative we get of Irish lesbian and gay history, which is the journey towards decriminalisation, the Norris campaigns, very Dublin-centric, very legalistic, very much a one-note history in many ways. And you talk a lot about this. You talk that there are other histories out there other than decriminalisation. There are other campaigns and there are other individuals and lots of more activism on other issues and lots of complicated histories. And you say in your article that the focus on the Norris campaign completely ignores the creation of a gay and lesbian identity in Ireland during the 1970s and 1980s. Perhaps people might be a bit surprised that it started as early as the 1970s. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, we're going back to 1973, really, when the first attempts to really look at the issue of gay rights takes off. And, you know, what's interesting as well is it's taken place in a cross-border basis. It's in the north of Ireland, really, that I suppose the gay rights movement starts on the island of Ireland. And it's a conference at the New University of Ulster in Coleraine. It followed, I suppose, efforts on British universities earlier in that year when the National Union of Students passed a motion.
What year was that? Sorry.
In April 1973, the National Union of Students in Great Britain passed a motion in support of gay rights. And that, I think, filters across. And students at the New University of Ulster Coleraine organise what Gay News characterised as the first ever gay conference in Ireland. And effectively from that moment on, then there's an attempt from individuals north and south of the border kind of to work together in the early stages to look at the issue of gay rights. So after the Coleraine conference, there's a steering committee comprising about 8 individuals, 4 from the north and 4 from the south. And they look at the issue of gay rights and keeping in contact with the likes of the Scottish Minorities Group and the Campaign for Homosexual Law Reform. And of course, then after that conference, we have the establishment of the sexual liberation movement at Trinity College Dublin. And soon after, then we're going to the first conference or symposium on homosexuality in February 1974. And from there, then really there's a strong drive towards, I suppose, the starting of the gay rights movement in Ireland.
Yes, and Mary Dorsey, one of the early guests we had on this chat, talked about the sexual liberation movement and also that conference in Trinity where she was one of the speakers. Who would have been the other people involved in that symposium and how impactful was it in terms of, I suppose, starting activism and starting conversations?
Well, Jeffrey Dudgeon probably described it best afterwards. He said, I don't know if I won't swear, but he said this was the big coming out event in Irish sexual history, because it was a pretty big event. I mean, 300 people crammed into a room in Trinity College Dublin. It generated considerable media attention. I mean, there was reporters there from the Irish Times, the Irish Press, and even remarkably the Farmers Journal carried an article which said dangerous is not different. And there was not Dr Noel Brown. I think he was a senator at the time. He spoke. Father Enda McDonagh spoke. Rose Robertson from Parents Inquiry was there. And Babs Todd as well. She was a member of the Campaign for Homosexual Equality. And Dudgeon again had a very good quote. He said, if Babs Todd continued, there could have been an outbreaking of straight bashing in Dublin that night, because she was calling on, Irish gay and lesbians to come out in the open and really start campaigning for gay rights. And it was very
yes. Mary Dorsey did say that the reason they had Babs Todd, because she was also quite famous, but they actually couldn't find an Irish lesbian who would actually sit on the platform.
Yeah, I can really believe that. Yeah, but I mean, they were there. I mean, Mark McWilliam was a member of SAPHO, which I think was a British-based organisation, and she would have attended the Coleraine conference along with Edmund Lynch and Hugo McManus as well. And of course, Edmund Lynch would have been then later a founding member of the Irish gay rights movement. And of course, Norris was there as well. You know, he would teach and lecture at Trinity College Dublin. But it's interesting, like, you know, you see those articles in the Irish press and the Irish Times and the Farmers. They're quite sympathetic and positive. Like, you know, there was Conor McAnally wrote in the Sunday Independent how he changed his mind about homosexuals after attending that conference. So it did almost, I mean, I know it was obviously still at that time homosexuals were, you know, considered deviant and criminal, but this kind of positive media attention was still important. And it, I suppose in some respects, this was the process of breaking the silence around gay rights and the way homosexuals are treated in Ireland.
And in many ways, would it be that, you know, this is 1974, you know, the civil rights movements happening in Northern Ireland, second wave feminism is happening all over the island of Ireland, sexual liberation, censorship is relaxing. So there's a lot more information coming into the country and being generated. And of course, you have the first generation as well of a lot of people who are going to university for the first time or college on to third level education for the first time. And is this a generational thing, do you think, influenced by all of those factors and perhaps more and more?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, definitely the civil rights movement has a massive impact. And you actually see at that Coleraine conference that Terry Bruton of the Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association, he addresses delegates there and he says, you know, it's time for Irish gays to come out in the open and start demanding their rights. And again, like the women's liberation movement, the contraceptive train, that certainly is having a factor and it's influencing and I suppose providing a certain level of encouragement to gay and lesbian individuals in Ireland. And I suppose we need to remember as well, in 1967, England and Wales decriminalised sexual activity, well, partially decriminalised sexual activity between males. 1969, the Stonewall riots. And you get a sense that, you know, that certain amount of Irish gay and lesbian individuals are aware of what's happening in Great Britain. They, you know, they have access to gay news, for example. They obviously have access to what SAPHO is doing because some of those were registered with the Campaign for Homosexual Equality. So there's certainly that discourse and that, I suppose, the vacuum created by the civil rights movement and the feminist movement allows and creates a space as well for the gay rights movement to emerge.
And they start emerging, like you have the Irish gay rights movement set up in 74, the Cork Irish gay rights in 76, Liberation for Lesbians, LIL, in 78, and many other of these around the country. And I want to look a little bit perhaps at both lesbian activism at this time, but also what is happening outside of Dublin in places in Cork particularly, and other areas that you've researched and written about.
Yes, I mean, Dublin was obviously just one region. I mean, you go down to Cork, the late 1970s, there's a branch of the Irish gay rights movement, and they go about, again, I suppose it's maybe it's different kinds of activism, different kinds of activities. So in Cork in the early days, it was in the 1970s, it was literally creating a space where gay and lesbian individuals could come and meet and discuss and, you know, come to terms perhaps with their sexuality and meet others. So the Cork branch of the Irish gay rights movement, one of the first things they did was to hire a venue, you know, and that was quite difficult at the time. You know, you'd have to have the resources. Would an individual be willing to rent to, you know, a gay organisation? That was a challenge as well, of course. So they set up the Phoenix Club in 4 McCurtain Street, and that becomes a home in many respects for not just Cork gay and lesbians, but also Munster gay and lesbians as well, right up until 1986. They have discos there, they have a gay switchboard, which was, of course, vital. And perhaps one of the most important initiatives of all the gay organisations was the telephone befriending service, because, of course, the majority of regions didn't have gay organisations. They didn't have an outlet to, you know, allow people to meet. So these telephone services were extremely important. And they really start the process of, you know, bringing a certain bit of awareness outside of Dublin around the issue of homosexuality.
And are they putting out any pamphlets, brochures, publications?
Yeah, so the Cork, I mean, they were short-lived. I mean, I thought there was a lot of work, and again, there's the resources. They would have, or Egan has done some good work on that. They published Cork Screw, as far as I know. They had 4 issues of that, and then they did Sapphire. But they also would have been part of, I suppose, the wider Irish gay rights movement newsletter, like In Touch, which was an important newsletter. So they would have contributed articles as well. Again, I suppose they're only available to those who are members, but they were short-lived. The likes of Cork.
Yeah. So the telephone service was more important because, of course, even if you didn't, there were no mobile phones, obviously. So you would either have to ring from your own home phone or a public phone box. But at least there was a telephone number, and that befriending service. Was that more like, having chats or arranging to meet people and bring them into venues, or a mixture of all that?
Yeah, it was a mixture of both, really. And that's why they were so important, the likes of Tell a Friend, which it was set up in 1974. It was one of the first activities the Irish gay rights movement got involved with, because while I suppose there's a lot of focus on criminality, really when you read some of the oral interviews, it's loneliness, really, and isolation, and this outlet of, am I the only one? What's wrong with me? Do I have the vocabulary? So when they see the likes of these advertisements in local press, there is actually somebody else that can talk to her. It was really, I suppose, quite transformative, ringing up.
They are taking ads out in local presses like the Kerryman, the Cork Examiner, the local newspaper that you'd get in every week.
Yeah, that's the one I think that surprised me most. Cork was a bit more, they were much stricter, I think, in some of the local press in Cork, despite the status of being the rebel county. The likes of Gay Information Line and Lesbian Line, they had a lot of difficulties in the mid-1980s. When you go up to Galway or Mayo and the likes of the Galway Advertiser and Mayo News, you'll see advertisements for the Galway Gay Collective and the Irish gay rights movement. So they know there, and I suppose it's one of the contradictions. We talk about the urban-rural divide. In the west of Ireland, those advertisements were accepted, and you'll see them throughout the early 1980s. The Galway Gay Collective is a service for gay, or it's a group for gay women and gay men. Send us a letter with the PO box. That was. And
there was that communication, and I just saw there Brian Lacey said that, thank you for saying that the North began it, and I suppose an early example of North-South cooperation in those early years of the 70s, and it was the homosexuals and the lesbians what did it. And you were talking about the Galway Gay Co-op. Tell us a little bit about the key co-op then in Cork and how important that was.
Yeah, so I suppose the key co-op was, primarily an initiative of the Cork Gay Collective in association with another progressive groups in Cork. The Cork Gay Collective would have seen themselves as quite socialist, quite left-wing, and while they were a gay organisation, their manifesto was that we need to work to free the oppression of all oppressed groups, and that we're not just a single issue organisation. And the key co-op fed into that, I suppose, that approach, and it became a very important space throughout the 1980s. In particular, I suppose, for women, they had a women's space inside there, and that's where I suppose the Cork Lesbian Collective emerges in 1983. And when you look at the campaigns, I mean, it's really there that you see, I suppose, the anti-amendment campaign really is where the Cork Gay Collective starts to leaflet outside there and do a rake of different issues. And again, it's a space where these progressive groups would have struggled to get, but for coming together. And it had a reputation as being radical. It was raided in 1984 by the police for offence. I think it was under Section 30 of offences against the state. Because they were seen to be possibly subversives there, or
But it's the same reason they'd used to raid Sinn Féin offices and places like that. So interesting that, and of course there is that very long tradition of left-wing politics and lesbian and gay civil rights organisations.
Yeah, absolutely.
Together. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, the Cork Gay Collective was. I mean, in the very early days, they were very keen to be getting involved in different campaigns. I said the anti-amendment campaign, but they were also interested in the labour movement, and they did an awful lot of work early on in trying to get the trade union movement, and successfully they did so to get the trade movement involved in the gay rights campaign. They had carried a banner, I think, in a May Day march in early 1980s as well.
So would they have been involved in the anti-amendment or the anti-apartheid campaigns then of the 80s, which would have been quite big in Ireland, of course, because Kader Ashmill and his organisation would have been really well known.
Yeah, I think they would. I mean, I haven't come across much, but I did read that I think the original idea was to have a shop in the Key Co-op, but then they started realising, they look at all the different places where the products would have been coming from. They wouldn't have had much stock to sell, because this place, the stuff that had been coming from regions where they wouldn't have maybe been supportive of.
Yeah, so, yeah.
I'm sure they were. I mean, they were also involved. I suppose some of them would have been, active in, gays against imperialism or gays against the H bloc. There was a few of them, not too many, and they would have been sidelined in the wider gay rights movement. They would have been seen as maybe controversial.
Yeah, and of course the Cork Women's Weekend, which is going strong still, I think, was there from 1984.
Yeah,
and became a really important part of the lesbian calendar.
That was the highlight, really, I'd say. Yeah, based on reading some of the reports, it seemed like a really good weekend, and if we could all do with those kind of weekends nowadays. Lockdown. Yeah, it started in 1984. I think the Cork Lesbian Collective would have emerged in November 1983, and I suppose the organiser would have said, listen, a lot of what was going on at that stage was very serious politics. I mean, it's at the back of the anti-amendment campaign, the efforts to liberalise the contraceptive law, which, were only slightly liberalised in 1979. Mm-hmm. So it was all a lot of kind of serious work. And again, they didn't have much finances. That was a big problem as well, was getting the finances to fund what they wanted to do, to fund the women's space. So the Women's Weekend was kind of set up as a fundraiser, but also an outfit where women from throughout Ireland, even abroad, would come for just one weekend. And they were free, I suppose, to express their sexuality and to be with women, and, I won't say no care in the world, but it was just a release, I suppose, from everything else that was going on. And I remember reading one oral interview with a lady who went there in 1985. And it's quite powerful when you read her interview and how impactful that particular weekend was on her. It was the first time she saw two women kissing. And it was that moment that she realised that this is how she identified, that she was a lesbian. And she speaks about it as being the start of a new life for her. Mm-hmm. And that's how important those spaces are. And I think those activities are often overlooked as maybe social, but in reality, they're quite political as well. I mean, if we think personal is political, that they were, I suppose, sending a message that we're resisting the status quo, we're challenging the status quo, we're not going to buy into this heteronormativity, that we're going to act out how we feel, or we're going to be true to ourselves. And we need to maybe give those activities a much greater acknowledgement in the historiography, because they were symbolically very important, as well as to the personal.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, and even smaller towns, you were telling me that Clonmel has a group there for a while.
Yeah, it was known as Apex. I suppose they had, it's same in Galway. They'd have to kind of, in certain regions, but if they'd be meeting in a hotel, they'd have to have code words or symbols. So in Clonmel, the code word was Apex, which meant nothing at the time. So you could go up to reception and say, I'm here for the Apex meeting, and they'd say, okay, it's in that room. So they might hang around in the lobby, and then they go into the room, and that's really where, I suppose, they were free to be themselves. And in this particular individual recalled in, must have been the late 1980s, an individual would come around with merchandise, and he'd be selling dildos and sex ties, and you're thinking, wow, the pink economy was taken off in Clonmel in the mid-1980s, but
yes. Yeah. And because, of course, when we read the historiography of it, really all that's talked about, and it's very, very important, and there's no denying that, is the Hirschfield Centre in Dublin, and that space and where politics comes out of that. And it's obviously, that's very true, but we can't forget all the other spaces in which these activism, this activism was happening, and all these, as you say, social spaces that were particularly political as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think they're a form of resistance, I would argue, in many respects. They're undermining the status quo, and that's why I interviewed Maurice Walsh. She was a founding member of the Galway Gay Collective. That started in 1980. And she looks back at it as almost being a failure, and I'm like, well, it's a very kind of narrow and maybe pessimistic view to look back at it, because okay, it mightn't have reached the heights of Dublin, but you were organising a gay disco in the west of Ireland in April 1980, where about 20 or 30 people turned up in a hotel in Salt Hill. And I would imagine that those people who came in contact with each other probably wouldn't characterise it as a failure. And it was the start of, I suppose, then Galway a decade later having its first gay pride. But if you go to 1988, the Galway Gay Collective is the recipient of a Padder O'Donnell Award, for their contribution to the community in which we lived in. That's quite important. That's before decriminalisation.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's all these kind of things that are kind of happening almost behind the scenes. But for those who are reaching out to the PO Box number and meeting up with others, that was gay liberation in many respects for them as well, because they no longer felt isolated. And I just, there was one letter which kind of stood out to me when I was doing my research. And again, it kind of reaffirms why these meetings were so important. And it was from a young Galway man who was about 18 at the time, and he was quite isolated. And he wrote to the National Gay Federation in Dublin, and he was like, he just wanted somebody in his region who could meet up and talk to. But unfortunately, at that stage, the National Gay Federation didn't have any contact in Galway. So his options were, if he can't come to Galway, they could put him in contact with a priest in Galway. And I would imagine that would have been quite disheartening at that stage, that, without going to Dublin, which was probably quite far back in those days, his option were a priest. But when the Galway Gay Collective came along, there was now an opportunity for anybody who contacts the National Gay Federation. Here's an outlet, here's an organisation, get in touch with them.
Absolutely. And of course, through the 1980s, of course, the newspapers, if they're talking about homosexuality, they're talking about the campaigns that are going on and the court cases, David Norris appearing on television and talking about that. And Norris is a very acceptable, respectable face of, obviously, gay liberation and gay activism. But I want to talk a little bit about the impact of somebody like Joni Crone, or Joni Sheeran, as she is now, appearing on the Late Late Show in 1980 and talking to Gay Byrne about being a lesbian in Ireland at that time.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think if you talk to a lot of lesbian women from this period, it's quite a defining moment in their own life, as well as in the wider history of gay rights activism in Ireland. I mean, she comes on and she's extremely confident. Like, she probably was nervous, but she's unashamedly proud of her sexuality, and she's willing to go out there and say, I'm a proud lesbian, and she doesn't want to change it. And she's part of that process whereby gay and lesbians will become more confident to come out and say, homosexuality isn't a problem, but society's treatment of homosexuals. Because what you'd see a lot of people say is that, well, if you're going to be homosexual, you're going to have a life of misery and loneliness. But what they come out and say, well, actually, no, I'm very happy in my sexuality, but what needs to change is society's treatment. And to be fair, I mean, there was some negative comments, but there were also some very positive comments, saying if heterosexuals were as genuine as that lady, society would be a much better place. And she really, I suppose, it was really, really important. And there was a friend of Joni's in the audience that night, and she wrote a report afterwards, and she commented on one lady when she saw Joni. She's like, but she doesn't look like a lesbian. So again, that was important, and kind of, I suppose, demystifying lesbians as such, because 2 years later, the Sunday World runs an article on 3 members of the liberation of Irish lesbians, and the article is titled "Ireland's Sexual Exiles." They had to fight invisibility, right? There was very few public And that's why Joni's thing was so important, because here there was this Irish lesbian, two things that you wouldn't necessarily put together, Irish and lesbian, mutually exclusive, some would have thought at that stage. You couldn't be both. And here's Joni saying, no, I am proud. And what's really, I think, powerful in that interview, Kay Byrne asked Joni, if you could change your sexuality, would you? And she just says, no, I'm Joni and I'm happy the way I am. And that must, I say, be quite powerful at the time for those watching it.
I would imagine any women who were questioning or girls, young women questioning their sexuality. And of course, the Late Late was in everybody's living room, and there it was in front of you. If it was on the Late Late, it was real life, it was reality. But there were other aspects of this activism that was going on in the 70s, particularly the 80s. And something that we were both agreeing earlier on when we were chatting that is much overlooked in maybe all the historiographies, not just lesbian and gay activism, and that is the student societies and the campaign to set up gay society first, and then lesbian and gay, and then it would be LGB, and then LGBT, and so on. But firstly, it was a campaign to set up gay society in the universities, which, other than Trinities, I suppose, would have been seen, the NUI universities particularly, as bastions of Catholicism.
Big time, yeah. I mean, you couldn't write a history of gay activism in Ireland without looking at the students, because again, it starts with students, it starts in universities, and they become quite important battlegrounds throughout this period. The Union of Students in Ireland was one of the very first organisations to publicly come out in support of gay rights as early as January 1974. And from then on, they're there, and they're providing, gay activists with the opportunity to write in their media or in their student publications. So you see very positive articles on gay rights, on homosexuality in the majority of student publications during that period. And even into the 1980s, like, they're inviting the likes of the National Gay Federation to come into campus to take part in their Freshers Week or their Societies Days. And in 1980, then the USI takes a stance that, we're going to have to try and encourage the establishment of gay societies. So what they do is they produce a document which sent around to different student unions, and they set out the importance of setting up gay societies, how to go about doing it, and then they put them in contact with the different gay rights organisations in Ireland. And that was, very, very important. Again, there were battlegrounds, I was saying, because the governing authorities did not want to give permission or recognise these gay societies. And there's a long battle. I mean, UCD, I think, had a gay society from about 1977, and it's not until 1990 that they gain official recognition. They were refused numerous times without any justification. And I wondered that when you look at 1983, when they apply, I think, for the second time for official recognition, they're doing it with a number of other societies who aren't granted permission, but they're at least given some feedback and reasons as to why the gay societies are the no. And that's why there's no explanation. Doesn't say like your constitution needs to be changed, but the other ones like you need to change this in your constitution.
But of course, UCD then would be still very much considered influenced by Opus Dei and very other aspects of the Catholic Church. Where are the first student societies being recognised by, say, the Central Societies Committees or whoever the powers that be are at granting recognition?
So it's the students would have obviously approved them, but it's the governing authorities, really. I mean, in UCC, they have to go through the governing authorities, and then there's another one. So it's like a two-stage process, or maybe the giant board. I can't remember the actual terms, but I think if you get past one, it's okay, and then it's kind of opposite. It's okay, but that's not until 1989 when you think about it. It was a long battle, and you go back to 1980, 1981 when there was uproar over what the student unions published in their welfare booklet, in which they declared that homosexuality isn't a problem. In fact, it's quite fun, and all hell breaks loose amongst the governing authorities who have to do investigation, and there's a report published, and from now on, anything the student unions publish in UCC has to be approved by the governing board. And then you look at next year. You look at next year, then 1982. It's a much different article on homosexuality, and the tone is decidedly different as well. So they were working as well, to make sure that this wasn't, promoted.
Absolutely. And then you see the students' unions, well, at this time, particularly from the mid to the late 80s, many of the students' unions are at the forefront, not just in getting lesbian and gay recognition for societies, but they're also at the forefront of repealing the Eighth and giving out information on access to information about travelling to England. So a lot of the Students' Union are quite radicalised. So in getting the lesbian and gay information into the Students' Union handbooks, particularly information around safe sex, and this is the age of AIDS, or HIV/AIDS, and where to access condoms. And when we think about it, it wasn't easy to get hold of condoms. Or any of that within the universities or outside of the universities.
Exactly. And I mean, I recently learned, was it maybe a couple of weeks ago, that, in the context of the HIV/AIDS crisis, and of course, Gay Health Action had no state funding, bar a measly £850. But in 1987, Trinity College held a fundraiser for HIV/AIDS organisations, and they raised £1,000, and they donated £1,000 to Gay Health Action. That's an awful lot of money at that time, especially when the state has only given you 850. So they were, and I mean, I think they were involved in condom sense as well. And, I think they were part of this campaign in the early 1990s to set up vending machines in a number of different universities, challenging, because of course you couldn't sell them in vending machines, heaven forbid, at that stage, it was frowned upon.
Yes. A couple of our commentators say, I think Patrick Shields said that he doesn't think the gay sock and maynooth, as it would have been then, was recognised until pretty late into the 1990s. And another contributor said her sister was in Trinity in the 70s and helped import contraceptives into Trinity. So good on her. But yeah, those campaigns were very important. And then, of course, the next campaign would have been to get onto student executives, gay rights officers, or then lesbian and gay rights officers, in the same way that from certainly the early to mid 80s, there were women's rights officers in Students' Union in the universities. And that gives a better support system to lesbian and gay students.
Yeah, it gives them a greater voice. I mean, what's interesting as well is that, like, you go back to early 81, the National Gay Federation, I suppose, recognises how important the student movement is, and they actually co-opt the deputy president of the USI onto the National Gay Federation Administrative Council. And I think it's in 1989 possibly that the USI appoints a gay officer. I could be wrong, but they certainly appoint somebody to lead on the gay rights issue within the student movement. And then you see kind of the likes of Galway, I think in the early 1993, they get a recognition. In Maynooth, as late as 1987, the college authorities described them as an embarrassment, that, they couldn't be seen to be supporting the gay society. But interesting enough, you can go through some of the Out magazines and you see some of the personal ads. You see some advertisements from priests, actually, which is quite remarkable.
Yes. Brian Lacey was saying there, he was in UCD in 71, 74, and the attempt to set up a gay sock there was opposed by the leading intellectuals in the university. But a bisexual sock was set up. Obviously not recognised, of course. But it's interesting because once the lesbian and gay socks were set up, there was often arguments within the lesbian and gay societies about adding the B then later on. Yes, that would have been into the 90s, so it's probably beyond the scope of your research, but I do remember those campaigns. And of course now it's LGBTQ societies that are in existence. So it's very interesting to recognise the impact and contribution of student societies and student activism, because of course a lot of these students who got involved or perhaps joined unofficial gay societies in universities go on to become the activists and campaigners and political activists who are campaigning for lesbian and gay rights further on.
I'd say so, absolutely. Well, I suppose, again, it's all part of that process of getting more people behind and getting people more engaged and aware of the topics. Because, as I said, like, you know, you couldn't pick up a gay or a student publication without seeing some reference to a gay rights, an article on gay rights. You know, like UCD and Trinity College tried to team up in the early 1980s to organise a gay pride week. And again, I thought that it's, you know, as you said, a lot of that generation probably came and started working in the 1990s. You look at the Galway Gay or the Cork Gay Collective, you know, Cathal Kerrigan would have started on the Students' Union, and he became very much involved in the 1980s, and particularly, I suppose, in around law reform, helping set up the Gay and Lesbian Equality Network. And USI would have lobbied as well for the amendment of that legislation, and also, I suppose, the adding sexual orientation to the Unfair Dismissals Act, which is often overlooked as well, which was amended in the same year that sexual activity with males was decriminalised. The Unfair Dismissals Act is amended to include sexual orientation, which was, again, you know, very, very important at that time, that workers now couldn't be dismissed because of their sexual orientation. You know, it's often forgotten or ignored.
There's a comment there from Jermone who said there was a sapphic society in UCD when the gay sock wasn't recognised, which is interesting. Maybe they thought it was to do with her poetry rather than anything else. But yeah, you know, sometimes there were ways of getting this under the carpet or getting unofficial recognition and just being allowed to exist and allowed to do your thing without actually the college authorities taking any responsibility. But that also meant you were cut off from funding.
Exactly, and that's why the student unions were so important, because, you know, if you didn't have official recognition, you couldn't even book the likes of a room. You know, you were just literally, you couldn't. So the student unions were very important. And I know we're going outside the Republic, but like if you go up to Northern Ireland in the late 1970s, you know, that's where it was in the student union that the Northern Ireland Gay Rights Association was able to hold gay discos when the venue that they were originally had closed down. And you're talking about 150 to 200 people. But, you know, it was because the students were brave enough to say, listen, we're going to resist the college authorities, and we'll book you a space here. You can have our venue. I mean, it was in Galway, it was the Students' Union offices that, you know, there was a gay line set up in the mid-1980s. So it's kind of the first attempt there to set up a telephone befriending service for people in the west of Ireland. And again, it's the student unions who provide the actual physical space and the opportunity for them to run that service.
So yes, so the students were revolting as well. There's a question here from Patrick Shields. He said the Students' Union movement in Ireland was a major force for change in the 1980s when official Ireland was still very much in thrall from the power of the Catholic Church. Wasn't there a big court case in terms of Spuck versus the USI and UCD? Yeah, there was, absolutely. And Trinity College students as well. I think Ivana Bakchek and Mark Little were both presidents of TCD then. I forget who was president of UCD, Students' Union. They were all taken to court by Spuck. But Spuck was also very concerned about the dispensing of condoms and various other aids to deviant sexuality as they saw it. It wasn't just abortion issues.
They were in 1991 over the Virgin store.
The Virgin Media store, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And another question is, what was the role then of the trade union movements in advocating LGBT rights in the 1980s? Well, it would have been lesbian and gay, basically. There was no talk of trans rights, fortunately, in the 1980s.
No, yeah. I mean, the trade union was extremely important, and there was an awful lot of effort put into the trade union movement in getting them to come out and support not only decriminalisation but also, I suppose, protection for gay and lesbian workers. Interestingly, it really began in the 1980s. So David Norris and Kadar Asmal, who I think went on to become a minister in the South African government. They had a motion passed at the Irish Federation of University Teachers Union calling on them to support gay rights. Now that was passed, but the executive decided that this wasn't something that they should be supporting, so they overruled the membership. But down in Cork, then the Cork Gay Collective again, Kieran Rose deserves a lot of credit, and Cathal Kerrigan for the work that they put into and getting the local government and public services union to come out and support in 1982 in support of gay rights. One individual from Limerick that wasn't too happy at that particular meeting, he told the delegates of Cork if the problem with homosexuality to go off and deal with that themselves, that Limerick really didn't want to be dealing with that. But it passed overwhelmingly. And then, of course, in 1992, it's proposed that the Irish Congress of Trade Unions, who come out, emphatically in support of sexual orientation. But again, that's all part of the activism of individuals within their respective unions. And then, of course, in 1987, the ICTU come out with this guidelines for negotiators. So now unions are encouraged to include sexual orientation in any of their dealings with employers. And interestingly, a year later, the civil service outlaws discrimination within the civil service based on sexual orientation. So the trade union is very, very important. And you go back to the first gay conference in 1981, they provide the Connolly Hall, that was the headquarters of the trade union, as a space for the meeting. So they were very, very important in lobbying for the decriminalisation and also the amendment of the Unfair Dismissals Act. It was very, very important.
And also Connolly Hall, from what I remember of my days as a student, was used by both women's groups and lesbian and gay groups as a venue for events, for social events. So the unions are very much supportive of both the social and political lives of lesbian and gays activists and people at that time. Question here, I'm curious, is there any mention or reference to LGBTQ people of colour involved in activism in Ireland during this period? Or have you come across that?
I haven't, not that I'm aware of. I suppose Jerry Collins famously said that Ireland was quite a homogeneous society in the 1980s, but I know there was, is it Simon Nicholly? I'm probably pronouncing his name wrong, but I know to the Cork Gay Collective would have been actively involved in some of his work. I think is it possibly in South Africa, but I don't recall.
That is later, I guess. And there is a Black Pride or Black Queer Collective now, and various other people involved in LGBT activism now. But one thing I want to discuss with you, as well as the students and the trade union activists, are also that intersection between lesbian and gay activism and feminist activism, and women's rights particularly around the 1983 amendment, the 8th Amendment that was put into the Constitution. And of course, a lot of the more radical lesbian activists would have been involved in the anti-amendment campaign, particularly those in Lille, and women who were involved in Irish Women United and had been involved in that. But there is an issue with the National Gay Federation, which is quite interesting, and you're right about that.
Yeah. So I suppose the National Gay Federation and the majority of the other gay rights organisations would have actively supported the anti-amendment campaign. The Herschel Centre organised fundraisers for the anti-amendment campaign. They raised something like £1,000 at the time. But I thought the anti-amendment campaign was slightly different to the Women's Right to Choose campaign, in the sense that the anti-amendment campaign was, we don't need this amendment. Mainstream.
Yeah,
exactly. They weren't coming out in support of a Women's Right to Choose campaign. It was this sectarian issue. And I suppose there was a lot more support for the anti-amendment campaign from different sections and different organisations. So the National Gay Federation was willing to affiliate to that. But when it came to a proposition or a motion from Lille to support the Women's Right to Choose campaign, it unfortunately led to quite a divisive debate within the National Gay Federation over whether or not they should affiliate. So you have the likes of Lille who are saying this is very much a gay rights issue. When you talk about the decriminalisation, you're talking about the right to bodily autonomy, you're talking about the right to privacy. This is the exact same issue women who want abortion are calling for. So that was the argument put forward by proponents of affiliation. And then you've quite I would say, a number of influential individuals who are coming out and saying, hang on a second, this isn't a gay rights issue. This a single issue organisation or only campaign for issues that directly affect gay people because they are gay. So this isn't a gay issue. But more importantly, I think the thing that was perhaps maybe swang the National Gay Federation to not affiliate was that this really is not an issue that we want to be getting involved with right now. And when you think about it, contraception was extremely controversial. Abortion was, was even controversial in the feminist movement. It was too radical. There was, what's interesting though about that debate is that, there was a ballot taken of members and a majority, now a slim majority all the same, voted in favour. But for whatever reason, and they never announced why, the National Gay Federation, after years debate, announced that they weren't going to affiliate. And this was reported in the Irish Times. And I think, it sent a message that, women's right to choose wasn't a gay rights issue, especially when the National Gay Federation was the most well-known organisation at that time. And Joni Crone later wrote that, it was felt as a betrayal, and it led to a lot of, we say, lesbian women not, working with gay men again, who had, to be fair to them, they had worked and, helped with the gay men's campaign to decriminalise sexual activity, but they felt quite betrayed, unfortunately. And I still think.
And I wonder, did the National Gay Federation split on gender lines? I mean, because obviously the argument that abortion is not a gay rights issue doesn't hold water. Obviously, women, lesbian or not, have to deal with, if even lesbians have to deal with pregnancies, unwanted pregnancies, etc., etc. Exactly. So, was it a gendered issue within the gay rights? Like, don't take the eye off the decriminalisation. We don't want to be talking about women's rights. It's muddying the water. Too controversial.
I mean, there were certainly some men, actually a good few men, who actually came out and, called on the National Gay Federation to, support the women, that they needed to show that solidarity. And what's interesting is when you look at the press release of the National Gay Federation, when they call on their members not to vote, not to vote for the amendment, they say that their women members have called on gay men to show solidarity. But then when it comes to this issue, that solidarity almost disappears. And again, I think there's a certain bit of political prudence. They're trying to be politically prudent, I think, here, because it is such an unpopular issue. I suppose the problem for Lille is they were in a considerable minority. I mean, we don't have membership figures for the National Gay Federation or Lille throughout the 1980s. We have one from 1990, which show that you've about 1,000 male members and about 40 lesbian. There's a massive discrepancy there between the men and the women. And there's obviously issues around sexism as well. And which isn't dissimilar to what's happening in other regions as well. But I think the campaign to decriminalise homosexuality or sexual activity was seen as the priority, and we shouldn't jeopardise. There was an argument that there was an argument that if they affiliated, they would lose credibility, that the media wouldn't treat them seriously anymore, that they'd lose their status as the main gay organisation. So they're quite concerned about their image, and I suppose there's a certain level of respectability here. Like, that's just let's leave that issue.
Don't want the revolting women, the radical women were a bit much. Yes. Question here: do you know if there were any LGBT or lesbian and gay back in the day radio shows or programs, or even, I suppose, content on media that would have been ostensibly lesbian or gay?
I know RT did a documentary with the Cork Irish Gay Rights Movement in 1977, but I think there was a gay radio. It probably was 1990, Outwaves. Now, I haven't looked into too much, but there certainly was. I think it was called Outwaves, and I don't know what platform they were on, but there certainly was in 1990 a gay radio show called Outwaves.
Could have been one of the pirate radio stations.
Yeah, and I mean they were literally focused on, I suppose, the news at that time, which again was the Glenn's efforts to decriminalise sexual activity made it, but also international news as well, because there was a lot of, I suppose, international solidarity at that time amongst the different gay and lesbian organisations. But there was, Outwaves. You'd probably learn about it in GCN, probably would have stuff in it, but it's not something
yes.
that
about, yeah. And one of the things I wanted to ask you is like the process of getting all this information, because of course you're not, this isn't mainstream history. This isn't, histories you'll find in archives all over the place. So what was your process of uncovering these histories? Because it's fascinating, that you've gone beyond that normative narrative of that one note history of that journey to decriminalization and the legalistic history and all of that, to show this kind of evolving and developing and really rich lesbian and gay identity that was there from the 70s into the 80s, which we take for granted now, that's out there. So what kind of archives did you use? Where did you go to find all this information?
Well, obviously, it was the Irish Queer Archive, but again, you have to be kind of slightly cautious because that, again, I suppose, was primarily the work of the National Gay Federation. So, like, Orla Egan has done extremely important work in documenting and making available archival material relating to Cork. But I found the likes of the mainstream press, but also provincial press. I mean, if you're doing a search, you'd be surprised. I mean, the amount of discussion or we say letters about homosexuality. You go to the Longford News or Longford Leader in 1975. There's a debate from September to December over, should we be using the word queer? And it leads the editor to say, well, we thought there was no homosexuals in Longford. It seems like there's hundreds of them. So like the mainstream and the provincial press was very important, but also the Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association archive was very important because, especially for the early years, because there was a lot of cross-border efforts between individuals north and south of the border. Gay News is a great resource as well. I mean, you're going to find a lot of articles about the efforts in Ireland in Gay News. There's a very good article, probably one of the first, which looks at the issue of gays in Ireland from 1972. Paddy from Galway, who clearly had access to Gay News, there was an article about an individual from the Campaign for Homosexual Equality who travelled over to Dublin to visit what he considered was a homophile organisation. It was actually the Legion of Mary, but he was obviously misled.
Yes.
And he took exception to the Legion of Mary being described as a homophile organisation. He was like, they're certainly not a homophile organisation. It's interesting because, Paddy clearly had access to Gay News in Galway in 1972. So Gay News was really, really great, along with student publications were an amazing resource as well. So yeah, that's an oral interviews. I mean, Edmund Lynch has done some wonderful work in documenting and in capturing oral interviews, and he's something over like 200, and that was really an important resource as well. So there's loads out there, yeah.
There's loads out there, exactly. And did you do any oral interviews yourself, or did you rely on Edmonds and Orla Egan? Orla Egan, of course, has done great work in Cork, and hope to have her on at some stage.
I did, yeah. So I didn't do too many, but I went to Cork, I went to Galway to interview Maurice Walsh, that was a great interview because again, she provided wonderful insights into what was going on in Galway and the challenges there in, even getting people to, come to some of the socials. Helen Slattery and Deirdre Walsh in Cork, who were, pioneers really in setting up efforts in Cork, the lesbian line. And Cathal Kerrigan. So I had a few, and they were very good. Really handy.
Yeah, and I think it's very important, I mean, I do it in my own work to name the names, outside of the leadership and the mainstream, name the names of the activists who committed their lives to something that had meaning and something that had real value and real impact on other people's lives throughout this period. And that is such good and deep history and complicating all these narratives that are out there. And were there any memoirs or publications or stories that are out there that you'd even recommend might be worth reading?
Well, I don't know if you can see it here. Queer Republic of Cork is a book that Orla has done, and I think that provides a really good insight into I suppose the gay subculture in Cork in the 1970s. The gay and lesbian visions of Ireland in the 20th century, that's really good as well, because you'll hear a lot of stories that maybe you mightn't have heard about. Johnny Crone is in there. Can't think of anything at the top of my. Kieran Rose is a good book as well. Diverse Communities. There are stuff out there. I mean, again, they're kind of histories, but they're from the perspective of people who were involved during that period.
Well, it's kind of the eyewitness accounts and the the people who were there. Obviously, it is from their perspective and has to be judged against the other archives that you are finding. But I'm very delighted to hear, as I've heard so many times over these conversations, that the Irish Queer Archive is such an important resource, and it always strikes me that it is so important to have such an archive in our national repository, the National Library of Ireland.
Yeah, and I remember you were talking to Tony there early on, and I was thinking about it's the Irish Queer Archive, but it's also an international queer archive, because when you look into it, there's an awful lot in terms of the International Gay Association, which Irish gay activists were helped found. I mean, the Hirschfield Centre was the secretariat for the International Gay Association from 1979 to 1982. So there's an awful lot of literature which helps, document what was happening throughout the world as well within the Irish Queer Archive. And I suppose the efforts of Irish gays as well in the wider international gay rights movement. So it's an amazing resource.
So not just north-south connections, but international connections feeding into the Irish lesbian and gay formation of identities from the 1970s on, and probably earlier. Just a listener or a watcher said there that there was a gay male couple living near his grandparents' house, I think, in Ballyfermot, and they were very much accepted by the community. And so as people just living their lives in communities helped with that process of normalization as well. So we're coming to the end, unfortunately. We could talk on and on about this. And I think your work is doing And of course, you're going to, publish this, which is great. Because doing all this research and not publishing it would be terrible. So if you want to tell people about that.
Yeah, so I'm just in the final stages of signing a contract with Bloomsbury Academics. So hopefully in the next 18 months, there will be a book on this, and encourage
with the same title.
Gay and lesbian activism in the Republic of Ireland, 1973 to 1993. But it'll cover a lot of what we've talked about tonight. And again, it's just an attempt to broaden our understanding of this period and to recognise that there were many, many actors who risked a lot and were extremely brave, and that they were part of a process of making Ireland a much more tolerant society, and that needs to be acknowledged. And there's a lot more stories we need to be told. When you look at some of the political parties today almost taking credit for this, and you're thinking, well, where were you in the 1970s and 80s,
Yeah, well, they're always bandwagon hoppers, so they're the same with women's rights. So it's a thing that political parties do. Once you look like you're winning,
exactly, yeah.
But then they come along and take the credit.
Activity to it.
Yeah, exactly. So thank you very much, Patrick, for that. That's been a fantastic chat. And next week, we will be talking to Richard O'Leary, and so we'll go more into the Northern Irish issues, and again, more that cross-border thing as well. And thank you for all of that information. It's been fantastic to delve deep into outside of Dublin, being a Kerry woman, I have to say that. I enjoy hearing about those histories. Thank you again, and goodbye to everybody. Thank you for tuning in.